Last time we covered the use of Smith & Wesson's end-frame revolver by the British Empire. Now let's explore the US's adoption of an emergency big-bore revolver from this same lineage. Hi, I'm Othais, and this is the Smith & Wesson double-action revolver model of 1917, caliber .45, another heavy US service weapon. Let's get a better look. Weighing in at 2 1/4 pounds and with an overall length of 10.8 inches, this is another fairly big revolver. Its swing-out cylinder takes 6 45 ACP cartridges fed with 2 half-moon, effectively en-bloc clips. Oh doggy, we are on episode 4 of our mini-series entitled Big Irons of the Great War. Previously we discussed the history of Colt's New Service and Smith & Wesson's New Century lines. Both of these guns competed for US contracts and both found favor in the UK thanks to their .455 chamberings. And as we've seen, both would develop War Office contracts early in the Great War. If you'd like to know any more than that about their development, check out the previous episodes, because today we're talking about how the Smith & Wesson saw the US adoption finally, the thing that it was looking for so many years. As you may recall, by 1916, the United States of America was a manufacturing giant supplying the Entente with millions of firearms. These varied from pistols to machine guns, and honestly went further into heavy equipment we don't cover in our show. But at home? Well, US production for its own army was growing slowly. Vickers machine guns were in planning, and we were gearing up more and more Springfield 1903 rifles, and Colt was hard at work on the 1911 pistols. Our efforts at the time, though, were rather tame, especially considering what we already knew about how high the material costs were in Europe. But the US used to be a thrifty nation with an emphasis on being careful with taxpayers' dollars. Wouldn't know anything about that anymore. So it was pretty hard to get the ball rolling, even with Europe ablaze. The real hurry wouldn't start until after war were declared. Now, with the US entry into the war, commercial manufacturers already set up to produce for the British would be turned to cranking out guns for the US forces. We've seen this with the P-14 and then the US 1917 rifles when 1903 production was too slow. In the end, the US had many more Enfields than Springfields. We saw it again a couple episodes back with the Colt revolvers as well, when the 1911 production lagged. But this didn't actually happen overnight. The US government wanted to keep just one pistol cartridge in the field, the .45 ACP. Again, this was a slower, heavier, smokeless round designed for Colt automatic pistols, and therefore were rimless in design. Yeah, that's going to be a problem, and the first issue with just plain chambering was solved quickly with a simple rebaited chamber for the case mouth. Now, I should say that reportedly Smith & Wesson was the first one to do this, to put in that rebaited cylinder so that this cartridge can ride in there and be shot, but not necessarily ejected. But I will point out, supposedly that's the case, and the earliest Colts did not have that ability, but this gun is actually a much later piece, more on that later. And this is a very, very early Smith & Wesson. This is a sub 20,000 numbered Smith & Wesson 1917, and I'm going to tell you that there may need to be a little more research out there because I can do that. So apparently at some point the Smith & Wessons were being done without rebaited cylinders as well. So there's always something to learn in history. It's pretty cool. By June of 1916, the US government was testing a Smith & Wesson in .45 ACP just like that, but it had no reliable means of mechanical ejection without the rim, and that's a bit more emergency than we'd really like for the war. So that matter stalled for a little bit. However, at the same time, there was a near solution already available in the market. Inventors Garfield and Larson, unrelated to any firearms manufacturer that I know of, came up with a simple clip loading system which held 6 rounds in place. A gap between the cylinder and recoil shield was left to allow the device itself to remain in the gun during firing and to eject along with all 6 cartridges all at once. The problem with this design was that it required a complex inner spring system to press the cartridges outward, keeping them in place. Now, I'm unsure of whether or not anyone at Smith & Wesson was aware of this device, but it's so similar to the ultimate solution that it seems likely that these inventors inspired who was up next, but who knows. Regardless, the final answer to the 45 ACP problem would come from Joseph Wesson himself. Recall, this is Daniel Wesson's son, who now headed the Smith & Wesson firm after his brother Walter's retirement due to poor health. His device was a clip similar to the previous, but greatly simplified by being divided into 2 3-round halves, and having the clip itself acting as the spring, being made of, well, thin spring steel. This device not only allows you to eject the rimless cartridges, but also ease loading, making it faster and easier to handle than loose ammunition. Y'all want to see a magic trick? Shazam! I done loaded this gun with rimless ammunition despite being a revolver. And then, this is the cool part. What point? Okay, maybe these need to be, okay, hold on. You're supposed to do that without bullets in them. But yeah, okay, I got simultaneous eject and I've got 2-point loading. I mean, this is way less finicky than loading 6 individual cartridges. This is a good step up. The patent was filed in June of 1917 and the US Army began testing immediately. I don't have a lot of detail on this front, but it appears that it went over well because it was adopted in a hurry. There would be scant delay and promises for an order of 100,000 units. There was, however, an exception. They wanted Smith & Wesson to allow Colt to use the patent. That way both manufacturers could get to cranking out revolvers and those special clips. As a matter of fact, Edward G. Budd Manufacturing and the American Can Company would both also be permitted to produce the spring clips directly for the US government. Smith & Wesson complied with these requests and received their first official order in August of 1917, although they had already started tooling up, which means that they began production practically immediately, if not even before the contract came in. And with that, the US adopted, well, this guy here, so we can finally take a closer look. Now, looking at the actual gun, it's just like the Mod 2, although the barrel is shorter, and of course we're chambered in 45 ACP, so we have that telltale gap at the rear that allows for the actual en-bloc clips, and they are en-bloc clips. So the only other outstanding differences on this particular gun come from the fact that it's an early 1917, so I can show you this particular feature, if you can make it out. See that hammer? See the ridges on it? Well, those are meant to retain oil so that it stays oiled much easier. It seems to have been added to the early Smith & Wesson 1917s. It's an extra machining step, but it's supposed to be extremely nice. We're gonna see how it goes over in just a moment. Well, we pretty much saw how this gun works last time. There's no big differences other than that clip system. So I think we can skip the animation and take it straight to Mae for a demonstration. This is a heck of a weapon. Now, the first contract began with an order for 100,000 pieces, like I said, and deliveries would begin in October of 1917. In November, the Ordnance Department would retest the Smith & Wesson and Colt revolvers. They found a couple issues. Those machine lines for holding onto the oil, they were also holding onto dirt. Stop that. Early production also had grips with dish tops. They were uncomfortable on recoil, and an unnecessary step in production, so knock that off too. And with those two things covered, Smith & Wesson could get production going in full gear for the war effort. That was all, those were the complaints. However, that's not necessarily a simple matter, by the way, to just turn up your production. The manufacturing boom during the war meant labor was in short supply, and so Smith & Wesson would stretch their current employees to the limit, requiring heavy overtime hours, which they did not pay time and a half for. Gotta watch that bottom line, you know. About this time, by the way, Joseph Wesson wasn't doing so well. He had turned to poor health just like his brother, and he was frequently out of the office. Generally, he did a poor job of staying in tune with the growing internal problems. The management still present, frankly, made a huge mess of the situation. I want to be clear, by the way, these worker conflicts were exceedingly common during the war. Growing unrest and strikes were actually a huge problem. Mining, transportation, construction, and yes, arms manufacture. While the manufacturing was being done largely for foreign powers, the US government did its best to avoid the worst, but otherwise broadly left the market alone. This, of course, is me giving you an oversimplified bird's eye. Exceptions do exist. With the US entry into the war, however, labor disputes became something entirely more disruptive. President Woodrow Wilson would intervene and form the National War Labor Board in April of 1918, comprised of both businesses and labor representatives. The board was meant to advocate for US workers, supporting 8-hour working days, equal pay for women, and the right to collective bargaining. In exchange, however, the board asked labor to not strike, otherwise tying up that US wartime production. In theory, the board had no coercive power unless you signed on to abide one of their mediations. So Smith & Wesson had overworked and underpaid their people, and the local machinist union arranges a walkout in July of 1918. Unfortunately, when those men were hired, they had agreed contractually not to join a union. It's a yellow dog contract. So Smith & Wesson fired the leaders of that strike. The National War Labor Board insisted that these men be rehired, as by their charter, the men had a right to unionize. This whole thing would end up in the courts before the dust was settled, and I'm kind of skipping ahead to say that Smith & Wesson was legally in the right, if not ethically. The Supreme Court decision of Hitchman, Cole, and Koch v. Mitchell had already shown that you could contractually prevent unionization, at this point in US law anyway. Moreover, Smith & Wesson never agreed to abide by any National War Labor Board decisions, so they stood on fairly good legal ground. In theory, in a free market, Smith & Wesson would have been legally able to double down on their bad ideas, and the natural result would have been a shutdown of the plant, loss of money for the owners, and this whole negotiation process. But the US government would lose out on their 1917 production revolvers in this particular situation, and the time to get that started again would be critical to the war effort, so yeah, we're not going to let this play out. So the invisible hand was going to be replaced with a boxing glove. President Wilson stepped in at the peak of the unrest in August of 1918 and ordered the War Department to commandeer the plant, nationalizing Smith & Wesson effectively. Army Requisition 709 of August 31st, 1918 to be exact. This formed a government-backed corporation, National Operating Company. Stock was held by the officers and directors of the new firm, all of whom were Army officers from the Bridgeport Ordnance Department. They continued production of the 1917 revolvers at a cost plus $1 model, so yeah, this wasn't really much of a private business. It was a shell to avoid a direct nationalization of the firm, and it's been suggested that this was done to avoid enrolling the workers as civil service workers, because the intention was always to return the property post-war. Also, I don't think this company even had letterhead. I just made this branding up for you guys to enjoy. Of course, all this was done as part of an expectation of an all-out push in the spring of 1919, a major offensive by the Entente, sacrificing men and equipment in a final push to crack the in-depth German defenses and claim a final victory in the war. But Germany saw the writing on the wall, and armistice was declared in November of 1918. This act saved a great many lives and for the most part ended the war, but it was a huge blow to manufacturers who had leveraged quite a bit of debt in order to build up their firms to produce massive US contracts, which were now being whittled down in negotiation. In order to prevent a complete collapse of the arms industries, the US government kept up its contracts into 1919, and although reduced, did mitigate some of the damage enough that the producers could limp away. In a December letter, the National Operating Company reported 58,613 revolvers had been produced under their guidance, with an unassembled component lot for, say, 75,000 more. They recommended completing these and then returning the company to the previous management on January 31st of 1919. This plan was whittled down to roughly 53,000 additional guns, and operations were halted in January of 1915, about mid-month. Following an inventory, the plant was then returned to private ownership on that date at the end of January. The new old owners actually shipped 7,300 partially completed 1917s to the Army and demanded payment because they had no intention of making 1917s for the commercial market. These were made by the military-controlled company anyway, so they should have to pay for them. All in all, I have found official production numbers from roughly 150,000 to 175,000. My favorite source for overall 1917 production says 163,000, give or take, were made for the US government. Roughly half of those guns never even had a chance to make it to Europe, and what few did, probably not front line. Their best bet as a live fire gun would be, say, a machine gun team. Still, these pieces were of importance because they both freed up the standard 1911s and shared a common cartridge with them, making them a very easy introduction into the supply chain. It's interesting to note that 1917s may have had a wider issue during World War II than in World War I. Plenty were retained on hand post-war, and like we saw with the Colts, they were occasionally used by federal authorities, although apparently not as often. My sources also vary on just when Smith & Wesson restarted commercial production of revolvers. I've seen claims as late as third quarter 1920, and since it is slightly beyond our scope today, I have not really broken that down. We talked last time about their other offerings, but specific to the 1917, Brazil would order 25,000 of them in 1937. These were shipped in 2 lots due to the US entry into World War II, one before and one after. During the early years of World War II, 20,000 of these guns were released to Britain as part of Lend-Lease aid, still in 45 ACP, and that same number again were fielded by the US Army in combat zones, but specific to the military police. Towards the end of the Second World War, the US government would actually contract to have thousands of Smith & Wesson 1917s fitted with a Colt positive lock style hammer lock bar, like we saw on the Smith & Wesson Victories, which is really where this idea came from. There were also experiments in chambering the end frame in .30 carbine to allow common ammo between, well, the carbine and the handgun, making it sort of giving you the most out of the possible weight you would pack into the battlefield. You could use it for either gun. Post-World War II inventory showed 91,000 and some change remaining Smith & Wesson 1917, so still plenty to issue, and yet 1917 production would see a last gasp in 1949 with a handful more produced for the military police in occupied Japan. It's not a terrible run. All right, I know that was a lot to take in very quickly, and we barely got to talk about the experience of the gun itself, so let's slow things down, take a moment to enjoy this piece along with Mae's opinion on what it's like to shoot this big bird. Alright gang, once more, not quite the same as before, but dang similar, because we are on the 4th episode of our big bore revolvers coming out of America. Now in this case we have the Smith & Wesson 1917 for Mae to discuss. Let me give that to you. And so I think the big question is, by the way, you guys really need to have seen the previous episodes for any of this to make sense, because otherwise we're going to be rehashing a lot. But the big question is there any big departure between the US production of the 1917 Smith & Wesson versus the sort of commercial and early military production for the British of the Smith & Wesson New Centuries in 4.55, which are all the same gun, just the difference in chambering and the addition of that half-moon clip. Anything stand out in the manufacturer handling of that gun compared to the others?
Not really.
Yeah, it's really just a rechambering to 45 ACP, although there is a big advantage. And, that would be dropping stuff on the floor.
That's fine, I've got one.
Yeah. So the big advantage is rapid loading. Did you actually prefer the loading of that over the old rimmed cartridges?
You know, I'm gonna say rapid loading makes a huge difference for me. It puts it into a whole nother level when it comes to revolvers, because you always think it's slow, single loading every time. That's the thing that always brings a revolver down. And these introduction of the half moon clips really puts them up into a higher speed category, which is fantastic. So it bumps up into a whole nother level in my mind.
Yeah, we talked about this last time, but the half moon clip takes what is a fine motor skill and turns it into a much more gross motor skill, and that's much better for a combat scenario. I think this invention alone puts these 1917 revolvers, both Colt and Smith & Wesson, to the top of the heap in terms of martial revolvers, but we'll see what your opinion is, because we haven't even answered the obvious. Would you take something like this into battle? Because you said it handles the same, it shoots the same, it loads a little faster. What's the answer here?
So I did say yes to the Mod 2. There's no way I can't say yes to this one because it's inherently better with the faster loading. Like I said, it puts it into a whole higher category. So of course I'm going to say yes to this one. Granted, you can tell it's been through some wear and tear, but even at that, it was still pretty smooth. I still shot well with it, and I got a faster load. I'd say I've got a lot of pluses with this one.
Okay, well, that's going to wrap up our episode.
Whoa.
Because
Hold your horses there, Sonny. There's some things we got to compare this to.
All right, you're right. That would be boring as sin if we just sort of came in and said, yeah, it's great, bye. No, let's put it into some perspective. First of all, we got to compete with Colt. That's the one everybody thinks of because these guns share almost the same name and people regularly confuse them, which is part of why we have 4 episodes trying to break up that history so that you guys can understand how different they are. As a matter of fact, let me make this clear while we have a moment. Do you mind if I go on for a second?
Go.
Both of these guns start as different versions of the Galland. So there's a Galland 1868 and then a later Galland de Guerre. But they both are, one is an evolution of the other, sort of, with new ideas put in from one man. And then Colt borrows one, Smith & Wesson borrows the other, and they start moving out. And for a time, Smith & Wesson is off in this top break land like Webley, which actually is probably where Webley got its evolution from, as the early Smith & Wesson work. And then Colt does the swing out cylinder, and this is the first and only place where you have one copying the other. Smith & Wesson adopts the swing out cylinder going forward in their design. So that is the one place, because a lot of people think that one of these guns is a copy of the other. Just the fact that Smith & Wesson switched from top break to swing out is pretty much the only time you see one company truly copying the other. That's where they start to come back together, and then market forces drive both companies into making big frame revolvers for big cartridges, and that brings them convergently evolution into the same point. So the guns look nearly identical at a glance. They handle almost exactly the same. They shoot the same cartridge. They load the same way because wartime pushed them onto the exact same cartridge, onto the exact same loading method. But realistically, they had very different development cycles. And that's the part that I think a lot of people miss out, and I hope came across in this episode. I'm sorry to beat that drum in the middle of your section, but it's the only place I can put it in.
To be fair, it makes sense. Just the only difference for me was that intrinsically, the Smith & Wesson just felt better because it seemed like there was just little tiny features here and there that just felt more natural to your hand of motion.
What were those? So less girth at the top, so a little narrower at the top.
Yep, for the Smith & Wesson.
Right, a bit more bell on the Smith & Wesson, like hooked under your grip.
And then on top of that, they also kind of bolster this out ever so slightly here in the center so that it follows the curvature of your grip. So it goes out, in, out again, so that it kind of follows the curve of your palm, which is something I noticed almost instantly. It's beautiful feeling.
And then you and I both agreed that if you point the Colt, you can't load and unload the Colt. And I have big hands, and I still can't get control of that.
Right, you have to effectively change your grip up a little bit on the Colt in order to pop open the cylinder, whereas with the Smith & Wesson, you can retain the same grip, and not only does it let you keep your grip, on top of it, where the push button is placed with your thumb, you're able to use your thumb as a place of purchase for your forefinger to pop the cylinder open.
So of these two, which is superior in your mind?
The Smith & Wesson has got to be the one. Smith & Wesson has to be the one that is the victor, just because it's more natural to use. And then on top of that, it everywhere else it was relatively equal, with the exception I would probably say is the sights. The sights on the Colts are inherently a little bit better.
Only by the advent of the fact that they used a triangular or shark fin looking sight.
Right.
Whereas you prefer that over a half moon.
Exactly, because the half moon it can get a little bit shiny.
Yeah. So militarily, the Colt is slightly preferred.
That I do remember you talking about.
And a lot of that has to do with the ability to refurbish these easier. Springfield is able to just make these barrels, whereas they had to purchase replacement barrels from Smith & Wesson because of that added lug, representing a whole other tool up for them that they just didn't want to get into. It's cheaper to have the company do it. So construction on this is also simpler. Engineering is simpler. Like if you think about the fact that this was solving for that crane walk problem, they solved it by not having the hand push opposite the crane. On this gun, they kept the hand pushing opposite the crane and just added a bunch of extra stuff. So arguably, that gun might be over-engineered. At the same time, the over-engineering seems to have resulted in a better experience for the organic operator. And so as a user of the gun, I prefer the Smith & Wesson. If I'm watching the pennies, there may be an argument for the Colt if you're trying to penny pinch, but that's not really what the US was doing at the time.
Fair.
So when we compare these guns to the worldwide, what comes into the same category as these? Is there anything in Europe that is delivering as well as the U.S. revolvers?
You know, probably the first one that comes to mind, I would say, would be the Webley. It's got a decent large cartridge with it, and the only issue realistically with them was the top brake. The fact that it is a top brake inherently makes it a little bit weaker, and then the ejection on those in general was not my favorite because you could snag a casing under there, but. Right. They were kind of natural use when popping open. It has its give and has its take with it.
I don't find to be a new production Webley alongside of new production of these to be particularly weaker in any one specific regard to the point of me going, well, I won't accept one, but I will accept the other.
Right. Fair. And then I guess probably the Belgian Nagants, I would say, is another one that's kind of up there.
That's going to confuse people because that is a gate-loading black powder revolver. How'd that get in this list?
But see, it's still not bad for the use. Like, it's still fairly smooth, and it's still really, really nice.
Yes, the grip feels good, the handling feels good, the pointing is natural, and very smooth action.
But then the problem, again, is we have gate loading.
And a black powder cartridge.
Yeah, that's true. That's getting there. So yeah, no, honestly, when you're thinking about it comparing to the world, you can tell the U.S. heavily focused on these, but it's interesting, this wasn't even their number one. This was like...
No, they never adopted these dang things.
Right. They were going with, the 1911 as their primary focus, so like, that's hilarious.
We couldn't make enough of our super cool handguns, so we had to make some revolvers, I guess. And the revolvers that the U.S. made, I guess, because we have to, seem to be the superior combat revolver in the Great War. Like, I can only think of one combat revolver from the conflict that I might choose over one of these 1917s. Only one. And I probably would, but I would miss the clip loading because this is it. This is really why. Don't get me wrong. They're smooth. The swing out is great. The loading's great. The clip is amazing. This is what throws it over the line because reloading faster and getting them back into action faster is truly unique about these guns. But can you guess the gun that I'm thinking of?
Is it the Greek Colt?
Yes, the Colt Army Special.
It's another Colt, though.
It's a mid-frame with a 38 special cartridge, and because it's a mid-frame and they reshape the latch, you can get on it from a natural position. It doesn't disrupt you as much as the full-frame Colt. And so that gun to me, and especially that gun, by the way, remained like a standard police sidearm for a long time. That pattern, it set the standard for police weapons for quite a while too. So it was a good combat revolver. I think quick loaders like these, if they shaved the back of the cylinder and just gone ahead and done loaders like this for them, that would be it. That would be my favorite combat revolver of the world. What's your favorite combat revolver of the war right now?
God, you know what? It's kind of sad, but I was pretty pro on that Smith & Wesson, the triple lock, but the problem is that it didn't do well enough because of frickin' the cover.
The actual shroud.
Yeah, the shroud. Oh my God, I'm so mad about that because it was beautiful. It truly was.
But it doesn't have rapid loading.
No, it didn't have rapid loading, but everything else about it was just singing for me.
So what's your pick? What's your favorite combat revolver so far?
Probably the Smith & Wesson 1917.
Yeah.
Probably got to go with that.
Not the gun that tugs at your heartstrings, don't get me wrong. Webleys are cool. Top breaks, cool.
Oh yeah, they're
not very
cool.
strong, but cool. And there's a number of other like Belgian stuff and things like that I've fallen in love with. Like I love the Belgian 78. Totally not the best revolver of the war. I would have to argue that the Smith & Wesson 1917 or the Colt Army Special, those are like the two top Those are the two top guns. In terms of revolver technology, which was all below a good semi-automatic handgun.
This is true.
So maybe one day we'll get to talk about, what was that, 1911?
Might be the right year.
Yeah.
I might be wrong on that.
Maybe we'll do an episode. I don't know. You know, you get busy sometimes. So I think let's wrap this up, right? You got any more comments on these guys realistically?
No, I mean, these were a heck of fun to shoot. I personally am a bit more pro revolvers, especially once we get into these Colts and Smith & Wessons. They tend to be my favorites.
Somebody's a wannabe cowgirl.
No.
And has been a long-time Smith & Wesson fan.
See cowgirl. Anyway, no, that's going to come off wrong, but that's okay. Anyway, no, yeah, these were a heck of fun to shoot. I thoroughly enjoyed them, but yeah, we're going to get into some semi-autos that are probably going to knock these out of the water, unfortunately.
All right, well, thanks for tuning in. We'll have updates after the credits. Have a good one.
Night, everybody.
Alright, getting very short update because I'm still getting settled coming back in from Cody, but number one on the list is the fact that you should watch your email inboxes if you were a supporter of our t-shirt campaign, because you're going to see tracking and other information coming out very, very soon, if not by the time you are hearing this. So, matter of fact, double check your spam folders, because when you start to send out several thousand emails, you never know where they'll end up. So look around, but pretty soon, I'd say within the week, you should have some pretty good data so that you know when your stuff is arriving. And we thank you again for that support. All right, y'all have a good one.